Welcome to Nican Tlaca University, an online resource for the liberation, decolonization of Nican Tlaca Indigenous people. Today's topic will explore genocide, a hidden history of an Indigenous experience. This is being presented by Nican Tlaca University and Nican Tlaca Women Warriors. Your presenter today will be Citlalmina Anahuac. Before we talk about genocide, we have to talk about the land on which this genocide was committed on. Colonized geography. The European invasions that erupted on October 12, 1492, lead to the dismantling of indigenous place names, identities, and power structures. We are talking about a genocide that existed and happened and has been happening on the Western Hemisphere, what we know today as North and South America. In indigenous terms, the way we are using it, we call this land Semanawak. To further discuss genocide, let us ask, what do we know about genocide? Well, if we remember middle school, we know of the 6 million Jews that were killed. We know of the Armenian genocide. But we have no idea of our very own genocide, the fact that we have survived the world's largest genocide ever committed in the history of humanity. This graphic illustrates the massive numbers of our people that were killed and compared to those numbers of people that suffered previous genocides. We have the one skull representing 1 million people, the first one Armenian, Jewish, and the last one Nican Tlaca. But what is genocide? Where does this concept come from? In 1944, a Polish Jewish lawyer named Raphael Lemkin sought to describe Nazi policies of systematic murder, including the destruction of the European Jews. He formed the word genocide by combining geno from the Greek word for race or tribe and cide, derived from the Latin word for killing. On December 9, 1948, the United Nations approved the Convention on the Convention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. This convention establishes genocide as an international crime, which signatory nations undertake to prevent and punish. It is important to understand that Raphael Lemkin studied the indigenous experience and used it in his description of genocide. And I'm going to quote. Lemkin evokes examples of genocide drawn from the Americas, where he puts into practice and continuously deploys the categories of analysis of the diagrammatic summary. In an essay on Spanish treatment of South American Indians, Lemkin, drawing in particular on the observations of Las Casas, successfully evokes methods of genocide physical, which include massacre, slavery, deprivation of livelihood. Family life was disregarded. Bread made of root meal was often the only food. When the slaves fell sick, they were left to die or at best sent home. The treatment of Indian women constituted an aspect of biological genocide, the death of a race. Slave mothers, exhausted with hunger and fatigue, could not nurse their babies. Children were not frequently carried off by the Spanish. Some Indian women were not only violated indiscriminately, but also taken to fill the harems of the Spanish colonists. In terms of physical genocide, the population of the islands fell catastrophically. In the Bahamas, the population dropped from 50,000 to nearly zero. The population of Nicaragua was almost entirely wiped out. In 14 years, more than 600,000 had died as beasts of burden. Lemkin says that Las Casas claimed that the total Indians killed in Spanish America exceeded 20 million. Lemkin adds that this number does not include those who died from overwork, the slaves killed in the mines, or the Indians killed during the active combat, nor the prisoners who were executed. Genocide, as defined as the planned annihilation of a national or racial group by a variety of actions aimed at undermining the foundations essential to the survival of the group as a group. Let us look at the specific details encompassing genocide and how it is applicable to our people. Genocide means the following acts committed with intent to destroy in whole or in part of a national, ethnic, or racial or religious group, such as A. Killing members of the group. In the Nican Tlaca experience, this is the very first assault on our humanity, and we have evidence from their own writings as European invaders. And it is really important to understand that even though it's been denied to this very day, smallpox indeed was used intentionally. It was a weapon of choice, along with the enslavement, deprivation, starvation, violence, rape that our people experienced. Smallpox took the biggest toll on our population, killing 95% of our people. B. Causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group. We have various examples of how our people experience this bodily or mental harm. More initially, we have the cultural genocide. Besides suffering the massive amounts of violence, diseases, starvations, slavery, to this very day, our people, we are still suffering the mental harm of being victims of genocide. We have cultural genocide, which is an example of the boarding schools. C. Deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. We have various examples of our people going through this experience. We have cultural genocide. We have the actual Bracero program, where our people were sprayed down with pesticides. Regardless of what the harm would be to their bodies and their health, they treated our people like products, like cattle. D. Imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group. This actually began upon their invasion of our land. However, in a more contemporary example of this, we have Margaret Sanger, the founder of Planned Parenthood, who actually was a eugenist, and she said that birth control must lead ultimately to a cleaner race. So, definitely, she was policing our communities and other communities of color into that philosophy. More recently, we have in the 1960s and 70s, Los Angeles and Mexican immigrant women alleged that they were coercively sterilized without their consent in LAC and USC Medical Center. This comes to us through a documentary called No Mas Bebés. An actual summary of this is the following. This film includes archival footage of the booming Chicano rights movement and juxtaposed with interviews in a long abandoned hospital. Interwoven are opinions from both sides of the landmark case, Madrigal versus Quillihan. The women who brought the case to trial are represented by a young and fearless lawyer, Antonia Hernandez. You should check this documentary out so you can see how the intentional sterilization of us as Nican Tlaca women is something that has been institutionalized in the medical field. E. Forcibly transferring children of a group to another group. This began since the very initial moment that they invaded our continent. We have lots of examples of how they would use children as slaves, and they particularly like kidnapping children because they saw them as easy to mold, as future translators, as someone that they can depend on to completely take over and indoctrinate. In more recent examples, we have Indian schools or boarding schools. There's a lot of research being done on how our Native brothers and sisters continue to suffer the mental and psychological trauma that this experience has left on them. This is now being considered as part of a very detrimental aspect of our people's health condition. It's important to note that under Raphael Lemkin's definition of genocide, non lethal acts also constitute genocide. We have this very vague idea that genocide just means massive killings of people, which it does. but it goes further than that. Lemkin understood genocide to be carried out through a variety of methods, ranging from overt physical transgressions like mass murder to subtle cultural threats like the restriction of a group's language and traditions, all of which were inextricably interwoven into a generic process of group destruction. That includes economic independence, language, religion, culture, and education. I, as a Nican Tlaca person, am speaking to you in English. Or si te hablo en español, es la misma cosa. We have been forbidden to speak our language. Our culture has been dismantled in its majority. We have been forced to convert into their foreign religion, to speak their languages, to learn about their greatness of white supremacy, while at the same time we have been culturally starved of our own history, our own heritage, and our own identity. Smallpox played a huge role in the genocide of our people. They used smallpox since their initial invasion on our land. Let us remember that in the Canary Islands, the smallpox and its intentional use caused 100% extinction. The Caribbean islands, it caused 98% of its extinction. In North and South America, it caused 95% of our extinction. It is important to realize that this was used purposely. We have a lot of historians and academics who say they didn't know what they were doing, it was beyond their control, but we challenge that by saying, how do you use this, which is biological warfare in Europe, and use it against your enemy at your homeland, and all of a sudden invade us, and all of a sudden you don't know about biological warfare? Of course they did. They may not have understood the scientific process behind it, but they understood how to infect populations. Another aspect of genocide is the destruction of knowledge. We have a clear example of this in 1554. This image is taken by Jerónimo de Mendieta in 1554, and I quote, "The friars took with them the children and young men that they had raised and instructed. They also received them help from them and common people who were already converted and wanted to prove that they were confirmed by faith." As Lemkin gave a previous example, they liked to take children and remove them from their cultural homeland, from their family. Mendieta's description of indigenous people as converts who wanted to prove their faith omits any reference to why they would want to prove their new Christian devotion. He even goes as far as to state that some of the children present during these burnings were expressing shouts of joy. His portrayal of an indigenous people as willing and receptive participants in European activities represents a common practice among European accounts. Europeans described the way that they treated us as very joyful. They made it seem that we were welcoming to our own destruction. They do not mention how they were publicly executing anyone that was practicing any type of remnant of our cultural traditions. To further illustrate the destruction of knowledge, there were actual laws criminalizing indigenous knowledge. On April 22nd, 1577, King Philip wrote a letter to the Viceroy Martin Enriquez, and he said, "As soon as you receive our decree, you must proceed with much care and diligence to seize those books without any original or copy remaining, and to send them carefully guarded at the first opportunity to our Council of the Indies, so that they may be examined there. Do not allow any person to write things having to do with the superstitions in the way of life of the natives in any language." The way of life, that meant anything. They felt threatened by our people learning who they were, what they did and how they described and expressed themselves. They wanted to keep that away from us because they knew that we were knowledgeable people, that we were a great people. How do we seek knowledge of our genocide? What do? We have to decolonize our identity. In the politics of this whole Hispanic, Latino, Latinx, raza mestizo, we need to acknowledge that we are the survivors of the 5%. We are the 5%. We have to understand that this experience took place in our land. We didn't go anywhere to experience this. We experienced this here. And even though they kidnapped us and took us to different places, it's still our continent. We have to understand that we are recovering from the millions and millions of people that were killed. We have a demographic revival. We had to have a full awareness of our continuous presence on our lands. And we need to have a desire to recover and protect ourselves from further dehumanization. Let's take a look at demographic manipulation. To your left, you have an example of the casta paintings. This was used in the 18th century by the elite of New Spain. So basically, they wanted to show you the different hierarchies of race. They were trying to say how important we were depending on how much white blood we had. The whole idea of mestizaje, the idea that we are more important, that we are more civilized based on our mixture with Europeans, is greatly invested in these casta paintings that were intentionally placed in social spaces to indoctrinate people into this belief system of white supremacy. We have to understand that this mixture was not a mixture. This was an imposition, a domination of European culture over the indigenous. Such colonial terms like Hispanic, Latino, Latina, Latinx, raza, and mestizo are created to destroy indigenous identities that connect us to the land that has been stolen and occupied. Let's understand that identity is power. They rather us identify with European identities because they want us to completely disconnect ourselves from the identity that connects us to our land in which we live today. These lands gave us birth and we birthed them into identities of indigenous heritage and culture. That's what we should reclaim. We should not allow white supremacy to continue to define us at their leisure. They give us white identities to give white supremacy power. If we look at the census of 2010, we see that we comprise the majority of what they connotate as Hispanic or Latino. They break it down into Mexicans, Puerto Ricans, Cubans, Salvadorians, Dominicans, Guatemalans, Colombians. But if you look at the actual amount of our people, our Nican Tlaca people that are defined based on these colonial nations, you will see that we comprise of the majority. So why do we have to sacrifice our identities, even if they're colonial at most, in order to give way into this illusion of this Hispanic majority that completely irons away any type of unique indigenous feature that we have inherited from thousands and thousands of years of heritage? And let us understand that the biggest myth is that we are no longer here. The biggest myth is that we're all mixed and we don't cannot claim indigenous blood or indigenous anything. The truth is we are here. We survived. We are growing in numbers and we must grow in our decolonization and our education as indigenous people. We must understand that our continent is stolen. We must understand that they give us white identities to keep us from understanding the detrimental effects of white supremacy to this very day. This concludes the presentation on genocide by Nican Tlaca University. You can learn more by visiting our various pages on Facebook, like our Nican Tlaca University page or our Nican Tlaca Women Warriors page. We also have a channel on YouTube under Nican Tlaca Women Warriors and Nican Tlaca University. Tlazokamati, and stay tuned for more lessons in Nican Tlaca University.